A Whole Town of Suspects by Suzanne Lennox. He doesn't look so good. Oh dear, I think he's dead. Minutes earlier, the murderer had started to mount the 2 steps leading to the outdoor toilet block of the country pub. Jake had peered through the dark at the murderer and slurred, "Piss off, you little shit. Go back to where you came from." The murderer was heartily sick of abusive behaviour and extended a foot as Jake lurched forward. Jake's bulk and forward momentum caused him to trip and tumble down the stairs, hitting his head on the decorative rocks lining the park back to the bar. Horrified, the murderer looked at the prone figure of Jake at the bottom of the steps and the weird angle of his neck as bright red blood oozed from a deep gash on his skull. As the blood formed a pool on the path and started to coat the grass, it changed to a deeper red. Back in the bar, it eventually dawned on the revellers celebrating the win of the local football team that Jake was missing. "I'll go find the silly old bugger and have a piss while I'm at it," declared Shorty, the man of the match. Minutes later, he returned ashen-faced. Detective Walker was preparing for bed when the call came that Jake Wellington had been found dead out near the dunny block of the pub. Sighing, he drove to the pub to find a definitely dead Jake. He was probably drunk and tripped down the steps, was the detective's first thought, but he seemed to have landed too heavily, and his body was in the wrong position for a simple trip. Maybe he was pushed. "This'll be fun," he thought. Jake Wellington was not a nice man and had a nasty streak that many of the inhabitants of the small town had experienced. As the news spread, thoughts turned to karma, or revenge, or good riddance, or plain indifference. Everybody had a theory of who had hated Jake enough to cause his death, but most favoured the grog and fall theory. Detective Walker interviewed the family. Maria Wellington was a quite dignified woman of Greek heritage, but it was well known that Jake was not averse to giving her a backhander across the face if he thought that she had transgressed in some way. Not that anyone said or did anything about it, and Maria was careful to conceal any bruises or black eyes with makeup, or just stay home until she healed. Alexander, the almost adult son, was expected to eventually take over the family's mechanical repair shop, but he had no interest at all in machinery and wanted to move to the city to pursue another career. Lately, the arguments between Jack and his son had intensified, and Alex was preparing to leave home with the blessing of his mother. Eleni was a feisty young woman and had always clashed with her father. He always demeaned her and made disparaging comments about her athletic body, or her clothing, or her makeup, or her boyfriends. Nothing she did had ever been good enough for her father. Next on the list was Guido, the neighbour. Guido was born in the town, but to migrant parents who arrived after the war had devastated their Italian town. They achieved their dream of a better life for their children. They were now long dead, and the children had drifted off to the city to chase their interests and dreams. But Guido liked the country life and was proud of his little farm. He'd never been interested in marriage, and the only cloud on his horizon, or actually over the fence, was his neighbour Jake. Guido was well liked and respected in the town, even though he was aware that a few considered him to be the token Italian. But Jake delighted in making nasty racist slurs whenever he encountered Guido, and kept reminding him that he, Jake, was a descendant of a pioneering family, and thus entitled to his privilege, and that Guido should go home. Guido had never been to Italy and spoke with a broad Australian accent. The pathology report confirmed that Jake had a skin full of alcohol. Detective Walker had interviewed all of the revellers on the night of Jake's demise, but most of their stories were alcohol-tinged and thoroughly unreliable. Walker was aware that he would not get useful information from any of them because they were members of the football club, part of the team, and not one would break the golden rule of mateship and dob on a mate, even if nobody was particularly fond of the obnoxious deceased Jake. Over the years, he had managed to get most of them offside for some reason or another. So many motives and so few clues. But Walker had a gut feeling that Jake did not just fall, and considered that the whole town was full of likely suspects. His superior said, "Let it go, mate. You can't prove that he was pushed, and even if he was, the perpetrator could have been just about anyone in this town." Walker was not convinced, but he stopped actively investigating the case, even though he felt it left it open. In time, it became a cold case. Many years later, an old woman would reminisce with her husband. "Remember that terrible trip up the highway when we stopped at that country pub so that I could use the toilet?" "I do, my dear, but as I've always told you, it wasn't your fault. When he saw at me and trotted out that old racist trope, I just snapped and put my foot out." Indira would still see the dead body of Jake Wellington with its broken neck and blood flowing from his skull, but that night she'd slip through the shadows and return to Sanjay, who was waiting in the car. Sanjay listened to her story, started the car, and they continued their trip up the dark, deserted highway. No CCTV cameras, no dash cams, no fellow travellers, and no witnesses to the murder of Jake Wellington, or any trace of his murderer.